The Cold War did not look like what most people imagine when they hear the word war. There were no mass mobilizations visible from the street. There were no official declarations read into legislative records. There were no surrender ceremonies, no front lines drawn on maps that civilians could follow in the morning newspaper. What there was instead was something far more difficult to describe and far more difficult to survive psychologically. A permanent condition of readiness, a sustained administrative posture that treated nuclear annihilation not as a last resort, but as a scheduled contingency, something to be planned for, rehearsed, budgeted, and refined across decades with the same institutional patience that a government might apply to highway construction or agricultural subsidies. The Cold War was, at its core, a bureaucratic achievement. And that is precisely what makes it so unsettling when you begin reading the documents that were finally released after the walls came down, after the administrations changed, after the classification periods expired, and the archivists started pulling boxes from the shelves of facilities most people have never heard of and will never visit. What those documents reveal is not a story of heroic restraint or wise leadership narrowly averting catastrophe. What they reveal is a story of systems operating according to their own internal logic, of plans proceeding through approval chains without anyone fully understanding what would happen if they were ever executed, of near misses that were not recognized as near misses until years or decades after the fact, and of a permanent, low-grade institutional insanity that both superpowers maintained simultaneously while presenting to their own populations a face of rational deterrence and controlled competition. The reassuring narrative that the Cold War was a long peace, that deterrence worked, that the adults were in charge, dissolves almost completely when you spend enough time with the primary sources. This is not a story about monsters. The people who designed these plans were not unusually cruel or unusually stupid. Many of them were genuinely trying to prevent exactly the catastrophe their work was simultaneously making more likely. That paradox is real, and it ran through every layer of the Cold War apparatus on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The machinery of annihilation was built and maintained by people who believed, with varying degrees of sincerity, that building it was the only way to avoid using it. Whether they were right is a question the historical record refuses to answer cleanly, because the record also shows how many times the machinery came within a malfunction or a misread radar screen of firing on its own. We are going to move through 17 specific plans, programs, and institutional decisions that were classified for years or decades and have since been released through declassification processes, freedom of information requests, archival research, and in some cases the voluntary disclosures of participants who lived long enough to feel the urgency of the historical record. Each of these represents not just a policy or a proposal, but a window into the underlying logic of the Cold War, a logic that was quieter, more procedural, and in many ways more terrifying than the dramatic confrontations that made it into the textbooks. The first plan we need to understand is one that most Americans have never heard by name, though its consequences shaped everything that followed. In the late 1940s, as the Soviet Union accelerated its own nuclear program, and the question of American strategic superiority became genuinely uncertain for the first time, the United States Air Force began working on a targeting document that would eventually be known as the Emergency War Plan. The earliest versions of this document, which remained classified for decades and were only partially released in the 1970s and more fully in subsequent years, outlined the American nuclear attack on the Soviet Union in the event of war. What is striking about even the earliest versions is not the scale of destruction contemplated, though that scale was enormous, but the administrative matter-of-factness with which it was described. Cities were listed, yield requirements were calculated, damage assessments were projected. The language used was the language of industrial planning. Targets were categorized by type. Priority sequences were established, delivery schedules were worked out against fuel consumption tables and aircraft availability matrices. What the document did not contain, in any version that has been released, was a serious engagement with the question of what the world would look like after its execution. The planners were not asked to model the aftermath. They were asked to model the attack. This distinction between planning for the act and planning for the consequences became a defining feature of Cold War nuclear strategy on both sides, and it had profound implications for how close both powers came to using what they had built. The plan went through multiple iterations over the following years. It became the single integrated operational plan, the PSYOP, which was the consolidated nuclear war plan that governed American strategic forces from 1961 onward and remained the foundational targeting document through the end of the Cold War and beyond. The first version of the PSYOP, PSYOP 62, which was briefed to President Eisenhower in late 1960, contemplated the simultaneous delivery of thousands of nuclear weapons against targets across the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. The total yield was measured in thousands of megatons. The projected casualty figures, which were included in briefing materials that have since been partially declassified, ran into the hundreds of millions. Eisenhower, who had spent his career in the military and was not a man easily disturbed by military planning documents, is reported by multiple participants to have been visibly shaken by the briefing. He asked a single question about whether there was any option to limit the attack to the Soviet Union and spare China. He was told that the plan did not currently include that option. He did not ask a follow-up question. The briefing ended. The plan remained. This is the first thing the declassified record establishes with uncomfortable clarity. The people at the very top of the American government, the people with the constitutional authority to order nuclear war, were presented with plans that had already foreclosed the choices they might have wanted to make. The targeting logic, once established at the operational level, created facts that constrained the political level. The tail was wagging the dog, and the people holding the leash had only partially understood this until they were in the room being briefed. The second plan, which connects directly to this dynamic, involves a program that ran under various code names through the 1950s and into the 1960s, and concerned the question of what American nuclear forces would do in the absence of a presidential order. This is the pre-delegation question, and the declassified documents surrounding it represent some of the most unsettling material in the entire Cold War archive. The basic problem was a practical one. A nuclear attack on the United States could, depending on its nature, kill or incapacitate the president and the entire chain of command within minutes. If American nuclear forces could only respond to a direct presidential order, and if the Soviets understood this, then the Soviets had an incentive to make their first strike as decapitating as possible, to target not just military installations, but the entire American command structure. Deterrence, in this scenario, breaks down entirely, because a successful first strike removes the capacity for retaliation. The American response to this problem was to pre-delegate nuclear release authority downward through the command chain, to allow commanders below the presidential level to authorize nuclear strikes under specified conditions. The documents that have been declassified, primarily through the work of researchers using the Freedom of Information Act and through the National Security Archive, reveal that this pre-delegation went considerably further than was publicly acknowledged at the time or for decades afterward. Authority was delegated not just to four-star commanders, but, in some documented cases, to levels significantly below that. The logic was impeccable from a deterrent standpoint, and catastrophic from a safety standpoint simultaneously, and the people who designed the system were aware of both dimensions. Internal memos from the period show planners wrestling explicitly with the tension between ensuring retaliation and ensuring control. The resolution they arrived at was essentially to accept the risk of unauthorized or mistaken use as the price of maintaining credible deterrence. This was not a secret within the government. It was, however, a secret from the public, and it remained one for decades. The third element of this picture is the set of programs designed to ensure that nuclear weapons could be used even after a command and control breakdown, what became known as the survivability problem. One of the most extraordinary of these, which was partially declassified in the 1990s and has been further illuminated by subsequent research, was a program to harden the communication systems that would be used to authorize nuclear strikes. This included the development of extremely low-frequency radio systems capable of communicating with submarines even when submerged, airborne command posts that could stay aloft for extended periods, and the Looking Glass program, which kept an airborne command post, a converted Boeing jet stuffed with communications equipment and staffed by a general officer with nuclear release authority, continuously airborne for nearly 3 decades. From 1961 to 1990, there was not a single day on which a Looking Glass aircraft was not in the air. The purpose was to ensure that even if every ground-based command and control facility in the United States was destroyed, someone with the authority to order nuclear retaliation would still be alive and connected to the forces. Think about what that means as an institutional commitment. For 29 years, the United States government maintained, at continuous expense and effort, an airborne nuclear command post whose entire reason for existing was to make nuclear war survivable at the command level, not survivable for the population, not survivable for the infrastructure, survivable for the war itself. The war-making capacity had to outlast everything else. This was the priority the system had arrived at, and it was pursued with extraordinary dedication. The Soviet Union developed parallel systems for the same reasons, and the documents that emerged from Soviet archives after 1991, combined with the accounts of participants who spoke to researchers in subsequent years, reveal a picture that is in many ways even more extreme than the American one. The Soviet command and control problem was in some respects more acute because Soviet political culture was less tolerant of distributed authority. The Communist Party maintained tighter centralized control over military decisions, which created exactly the decapitation vulnerability that the Americans were trying to solve through pre-delegation. The Soviet solution was, in some documented respects, more radical. They developed what became known in the West as the dead hand system, a set of automated mechanisms that could, under specified conditions, launch nuclear weapons without any human decision at the moment of launch. The system, whose Russian name translates roughly as perimeter, was designed to detect a nuclear attack through seismic and radiation sensors and, if it concluded that the leadership had been destroyed, to send launch commands directly to missiles through a network of hardened communication rockets. A small duty crew, sheltered deep underground, could in theory be the last human link in a chain that ended in a global nuclear strike. The existence of this system was not confirmed to Western governments until the Soviet Union collapsed. American officials who learned about it in the early 1990s were, by the accounts that have been published, genuinely horrified. Not because the concept was alien, but because it represented the logical endpoint of exactly the same reasoning that had guided American planning. Both sides had been, independently and in parallel, designing systems that could fight a nuclear war without requiring human beings to consciously choose to do so in the final moments. The deterrence architecture had evolved on both sides toward automation. The question of who would actually decide to end the world had been quietly transferred from presidents and premiers to censors and algorithms and duty officers in hardened bunkers, and neither side had fully told its own public that this transfer had occurred. The fourth program that declassification has illuminated involves the systematic planning for nuclear war in Europe, which was conducted by NATO through the 1950s, 1960s, and into subsequent decades with a thoroughness that the public documents of the period deliberately obscured. The alliance's public posture was one of conventional deterrence, supplemented by nuclear weapons as a last resort. The classified planning documents tell a different story. The war games and planning exercises that have been released, including portions of the Carte Blanche exercise from 1955 and subsequent NATO nuclear planning documents, reveal that the actual operational plans for defending Western Europe against a Soviet conventional attack involved the early and massive use of tactical nuclear weapons, not as a last resort, but as the primary means of halting Soviet armored columns that NATO's conventional forces were assessed as being unable to stop. The Carte Blanche exercise, whose results were partially released and caused a significant internal crisis when a summary leaked to the German press, modeled a scenario in which hundreds of nuclear weapons were detonated over a period of days in a zone roughly corresponding to the Federal Republic of Germany. The exercise concluded that NATO's nuclear responses would be militarily effective in slowing the Soviet advance. It also calculated, in figures that the participants found disturbing enough to suppress from the public report, that the immediate casualties among the West German civilian population would be in the millions. The territory being defended would, in the process of its defense, be rendered uninhabitable. The German government was aware of this planning. The German public was not. This remained the operational reality of NATO's defense plans for a significant portion of the Cold War, and it was sustained through a combination of classification, deliberate ambiguity in public statements, and the institutional reluctance of everyone involved to follow the logic all the way to its conclusion in front of an audience. The fifth program involves a decision made in the early years of the Cold War that shaped the entire subsequent history of nuclear risk, though it was not publicly acknowledged for decades. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States began deploying nuclear weapons to overseas bases, in Britain, in Germany, in Guam, in various Pacific installations. This deployment was done under a set of arrangements that were, from a safety and authorization standpoint, significantly less rigorous than what the American public would have accepted had it known. The weapons were stored in conditions that, as the declassified safety reviews conducted in subsequent years make clear, created substantial risks of accidents, unauthorized use, and in some cases simple theft or capture by hostile forces. The review documents, produced by the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project and its successors, and released in heavily redacted form over subsequent decades, contain passages that read like accident reports from a particularly dangerous industrial facility. Weapons were stored in inadequately secured locations. Safety mechanisms were primitive by later standards. Procedures for preventing unauthorized arming were incomplete. A 1960 review of nuclear weapons safety that was conducted by a committee led by Dr. Herbert York and has been partially declassified found a pattern of safety deficiencies that the committee described in language that was carefully restrained but unmistakably alarmed. The committee noted that the probability of an accidental or unauthorized detonation, while not quantified with precision, was not negligible. This was the finding of an internal review. It was classified. The deployment continued. The accidents themselves form the sixth major area of declassified revelation, and they are perhaps the most viscerally disturbing part of the Cold War record for anyone who encounters them for the first time. The United States government maintained for decades the position that no nuclear weapon had ever been lost, in a condition that posed a public safety risk, and that no accidental nuclear detonation had ever come close to occurring. The declassified record contradicts this position in detail and at multiple points. The 1966 Palomares incident, in which a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker over Spain, scattering 3 weapons on land and 1 in the Mediterranean Sea, was publicly acknowledged at the time. It was too visible to hide. But the full safety reports on the condition of the recovered weapons were classified for years, and when they were finally released in partially redacted form, they revealed that 2 of the weapons had experienced conventional explosive detonations sufficient to scatter plutonium across a significant area of Spanish farmland. The weapons had not achieved nuclear yield, which was the outcome that would have been immediately catastrophic. But the line between the accident that occurred and a nuclear detonation was narrower than the public statements of the time implied. The 1961 Goldsboro incident, in which a B-52 broke apart over North Carolina and dropped 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, is now one of the most extensively documented nuclear near accidents in American history. Though it remained substantially classified for decades and the full extent of the risk was not publicly confirmed until the release of a formerly secret safety report in 2013. The document, obtained through a Freedom of Information request by journalist Eric Schlosser during his research into the history of nuclear accidents, confirmed that one of the two bombs had gone through most of the arming sequence after release. 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on the weapon had failed. A single low-voltage switch, a device that could be disrupted by something as mundane as a power surge, was the last barrier between the accident and a nuclear detonation in North Carolina in January 1961. The weapon's yield was approximately 4 megatons. The Goldsboro area and a substantial portion of the eastern seaboard was not destroyed because one switch did not fail. That is the entirety of the safety margin that existed. The 7th area of declassified revelation concerns what happened when radar systems and early warning networks produced false indications of incoming Soviet missile attacks, and how close those false alarms came to triggering nuclear retaliation before they were identified as errors. The most extensively documented cases on the American side involve incidents in 1979 and 1980. When the North American Aerospace Defense Command's computers generated warnings of large-scale Soviet missile launches that turned out to be the result of software errors and, in one case, a test tape being fed into a live system by mistake. The 1979 incident, which occurred on the night of November 9th, generated a warning of what appeared to be a full Soviet missile attack. The NORAD duty officer contacted the National Security Advisor. A conference call was established. Military forces were moved toward higher alert levels. The incident lasted approximately 6 minutes before it was identified as a false alarm. 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, the United States came measurably closer to launching a nuclear response to an attack that had never occurred than at almost any other moment in the Cold War, with the possible exception of October 1962. The cause was a training tape. A simulation of exactly the scenario that the system was then generating as a real alert. The tape had been loaded onto a live system. The system had processed it as real data and distributed the results to warning displays across the command network. The 1980 incident, 3 months later, was caused by a faulty computer chip worth approximately 46 cents. The chip generated a pattern of incoming missile warnings that were plausible enough to trigger higher-level alerts and scrambles of nuclear-armed aircraft before the error was identified. The aircraft were recalled. The chip was replaced. No public acknowledgement of the incidents was made until congressional inquiries some months later forced a partial disclosure, and the full details remained classified for years. What neither of these incidents conveyed adequately, because they were both American-side events with American-side resolutions, was how the same dynamic was playing out on the Soviet side simultaneously. The Soviet early warning system had its own failures, its own false alarms, and its own moments when a single officer's decision stood between a mistake and a catastrophe. The most documented of these on the Soviet side is the September 1983 incident involving Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was the duty officer at a Soviet missile warning center when the system generated an alert indicating that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles at the Soviet Union. Petrov's decision not to report this as a confirmed attack, based on his judgment that the alert pattern was inconsistent with how an actual American first strike would appear, was not in accordance with his training. His training said to report. His judgment said something was wrong with the sensor data. He reported a malfunction rather than an attack. He was correct. The alert was caused by the Soviet satellite's misidentification of sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile exhaust plumes. But Petrov did not know that when he made his decision. He knew only that his system was showing 5 incoming missiles and that his protocol was to report it as an attack. The fact that he deviated from his protocol, that he trusted his own assessment over his instrumentation, is the reason that September 1983 did not end with a Soviet nuclear strike on the United States and an American response. Petrov was not praised for his decision. He was reprimanded for failing to keep proper log entries during the incident. His story was classified and remained unknown in the West for more than a decade. The 8th program involves what was done to the American and Soviet economies and societies in the name of nuclear preparedness, and what the declassified documents from the period reveal about how the planners thought about the civilian population. The civil defense programs that both governments maintained were never, according to the internal documents, seriously believed by their authors to be capable of protecting the civilian population from a full nuclear exchange. They were designed for other purposes. On the American side, civil defense served partly as a public relations function, communicating to the population that something was being done, while the actual planning documents, which were classified, showed that planners expected civilian casualties in the tens of millions, even in optimistic attack scenarios. On the Soviet side, civil defense was more elaborately developed and more seriously funded, but the internal assessments were equally pessimistic about its capacity to protect the population from a large-scale American nuclear attack. The documents that have been released from this period include a Federal Emergency Management Agency planning document from the early 1980s, portions of which were declassified in subsequent years, that modeled nuclear attack scenarios and their aftermath with a level of detail that makes for genuinely difficult reading. The document projected casualty figures, infrastructure damage, and resource requirements for various attack scenarios. One of the attack scenarios modeled, which planners treated as a mid-range case rather than a worst case, projected immediate deaths in the range of 140 million Americans. The document's discussion of recovery planning for this scenario is notable for its administrative composure. Reconstruction timelines are projected. Resource allocation priorities are established. The document proceeds as though the event it is modeling is a hurricane, rather than the effective end of American civilization. This administrative composure, this procedural engagement with scenarios that in any other context would be recognized as catastrophic beyond any meaningful response, is one of the defining characteristics of Cold War planning documents across both sides and across the entire period. The planners were not unaware of the scale of what they were contemplating. The casualty figures were in the documents, but the institutional culture demanded that the figures be processed within a planning framework rather than confronted as a moral reality, and so they were. The 9th program, which connects to this and has been substantially illuminated by declassification, concerns the American government's plans for continuity after a nuclear attack, what would survive and what would not, and who the government was actually designed to protect in its underground configuration. The documents relating to the Mount Weather facility in Virginia, the Raven Rock complex in Pennsylvania, and the broader network of hardened facilities built to house the federal government after a nuclear exchange have been partially released over the years, and they reveal a continuity of government architecture that was, in several important respects, more concerned with preserving the administrative structure than with maintaining democratic accountability. The plans that have been released show that the continuity of government apparatus was designed to preserve a functioning executive and military command structure capable of directing nuclear retaliation and managing the immediate post-attack environment. They were not designed to preserve elections, congressional function, or judicial review within any foreseeable time frame. The government that would emerge from a nuclear exchange, according to the classified plans that survived their classification periods, would be an emergency executive government of indefinite duration, operating under pre-delegated emergency authorities, managing survivors in a shattered landscape, and doing so without the constitutional infrastructure that the government was nominally designed to uphold. This was not a secret within the government. It was again a secret from the public, and it was one that the officials involved apparently felt they could not disclose without undermining public confidence in the system they were maintaining. The 10th program involves one of the most consequential and least publicly understood decisions of the entire Cold War: the decision to deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe in the early 1980s, and the secret negotiations that surrounded the subsequent removal of those missiles. The deployment decision, which resulted in the placement of Pershing II ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe beginning in 1983, was accompanied by a set of classified assessments of Soviet vulnerability that have since been partially released. These assessments showed that the Pershing II missiles, with their combination of range, accuracy, and flight time, created what Soviet military planners had long feared most: a genuine first-strike threat against Soviet command and control facilities. The missiles could, according to the classified assessments, reach targets in the Western Soviet Union within approximately 6 to 8 minutes of launch. The Soviet response to this deployment, documented in materials that became available after the Soviet collapse and in subsequent Russian archival releases, was a significant elevation in the alert posture of Soviet nuclear forces and an acceleration of the automated response systems described earlier. The Soviets interpreted the deployment as preparation for a first strike, not as a defensive measure, and they responded by moving their own decision timelines closer to the automatic end of the spectrum. The two sides were, in this period, simultaneously increasing the speed and reducing the human control of their respective nuclear arsenals, each in response to what it perceived as the other side's provocations, in a mutual dynamic that neither side's public communications acknowledged and that neither side's leadership appears to have fully understood in real time. The Able Archer 83 exercise, conducted by NATO in November 1983, brought this dynamic to what is now recognized as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War, though it was not recognized as such by American officials at the time. The exercise simulated a NATO transition from conventional to nuclear war, with a realism and a command structure that Soviet intelligence interpreted as potentially being cover for an actual attack. Soviet nuclear forces in Europe were placed on an elevated alert status. Some Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons and prepared for immediate launch. A KGB intelligence operation known as Ryan, which had been established specifically to detect indicators of an American nuclear first strike, was generating reports that its indicators were present. The American government did not know in November 1983 how close the Soviet military was to interpreting the Able Archer exercise as the beginning of a real war. It knew this only later, primarily through intelligence provided by a British double agent inside Soviet intelligence named Oleg Gordievsky, whose reports reached Western governments after he defected in 1985. The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board conducted a review and concluded in a report that was classified for years and partially released in 1990 that the United States may have inadvertently placed itself in a situation in which the Soviet Union genuinely believed a nuclear attack was imminent. The full extent of Soviet alert measures during Able Archer 83 was not known to American officials until later archival and intelligence work filled in the picture further. What the full picture shows is a moment in which a NATO exercise that was intended to demonstrate readiness came within the margin of Soviet miscalculation of triggering an actual Soviet nuclear strike. Not because anyone on either side wanted war, not because there was a genuine military crisis, because an exercise looked, to the instruments and the analysts and the command culture on the Soviet side, sufficiently like the real thing that the Soviet system moved toward responding to it as real. The 11th area of declassification concerns a program that ran through the 1950s and into the 1960s and involved the systematic violation of Soviet airspace by American reconnaissance aircraft, an activity that was politically explosive when it was acknowledged and is considerably more explosive in its full classified dimensions. The U-2 program, which became publicly known when Francis Gary Powers was shot down in May 1960, has been written about extensively. What has been less extensively covered, because the documents remained classified longer and in some cases have only been partially released, is the full scope of peripheral reconnaissance operations and, more significantly, the deliberate penetrations of Soviet airspace by aircraft that were not reconnaissance planes but were engaged in electronic intelligence collection, testing of Soviet air defenses, and in some cases operations whose purpose has still not been fully declassified. The documents that have been released by the National Security Agency and the Air Force in response to Freedom of Information requests, and the accounts provided by surviving participants to researchers and oral history projects, establish that dozens of American aircraft were shot down or lost over Soviet territory and its periphery during the Cold War, with loss of life, and that the American government did not acknowledge these losses publicly or pursue the return of surviving crew members. With anything approaching the diplomatic energy it applied to acknowledged incidents. The families of crew members who were killed or captured were in some documented cases told that their relatives had died in training accidents. The Soviet Union held some of these crew members for years. The American government's response was to classify the operations rather than demand their release, because demanding their release would have required acknowledging the operations. This pattern, the classification of the evidence of an operation's existence as the mechanism for avoiding accountability for its consequences, runs through many Cold War programs and represents one of the most consistent features of the institutional behavior that the declassified record documents. The system generated events that could not be acknowledged, and the response to those events was to extend the classification rather than to address the human cost. The 12th program involves the nuclear testing record and specifically the internal assessments of the health consequences of atmospheric nuclear testing that were conducted by the Atomic Energy Commission and the military services during the 1950s, and that were classified at the time and remained classified for years. The testing program, which detonated more than 100 nuclear weapons in the atmosphere over the Nevada test site and in the Pacific between 1945 and the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, was accompanied by an extensive internal monitoring program that tracked fallout patterns, radiation exposures in nearby populations, and the health outcomes of both military personnel who were deliberately exposed during exercises and civilian populations downwind of the Nevada tests. The documents that have been released, through a combination of congressional investigations, litigation, and freedom of information requests over subsequent decades, show that the internal assessments were considerably more alarming than the public statements of the period. Radiation exposures in downwind communities in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona were higher than the public was told. The health risks to military personnel who participated in atomic exercises were known to be significant and were documented internally, while the participants were being publicly told that the exercises were safe. The relationship between the testing and subsequent cancer rates in affected populations was the subject of internal analysis that reached conclusions the external public statements did not reflect. This was not the result of a single decision to deceive. It was the result of an institutional culture in which the classification of inconvenient findings was routine, in which the political and strategic importance of the testing program created pressure not to generate findings that would complicate its continuation, and in which the people making decisions about what to tell the public and what to classify were not the same people whose communities were being irradiated. The geography of the testing program was not accidental. The downwind communities in Nevada and Utah were rural, largely working class, and in many cases politically disengaged from the centers of power where the decisions were made. This pattern of who bore the risk and who made the decisions about disclosing it is one of the consistent structural features of the Cold War testing and weapons programs. The 13th program, that deserves extended consideration, is one that operated at the boundary between intelligence and covert action, and that has been partially illuminated by declassification, but remains substantially incomplete in the public record. This is the set of programs through which both the United States and the Soviet Union attempted to develop, and in some cases deploy, non-nuclear weapons, specifically designed to interfere with the other side's command and control systems. The American programs in this area, which operated under various classification compartments and oversight structures, included research into directed energy weapons, electromagnetic pulse effects, and techniques for disrupting radar and communication systems that would be used for nuclear command and control. The Soviet programs in the same area, which became somewhat better known after the Soviet collapse through a combination of defector accounts and archival research, included work on systems designed to interfere with American satellite communications and early warning networks. What the partial record establishes is that both sides were, throughout much of the Cold War, actively investing in the capacity to blind the other side's warning systems. to create exactly the conditions under which an automated response system or a pre-delegated authority would be most likely to fire without adequate information. The two sides were simultaneously building the automated systems and building the tools to degrade those systems' ability to function correctly. The combination of these two investments, each driven by a straightforward strategic logic, created a risk architecture that neither side had fully modeled. The 14th area involves the record of what happened when nuclear-armed submarines operated in close proximity in the confined waters of the North Atlantic and the Pacific, and how many incidents occurred between American and Soviet submarines that were never publicly acknowledged. The naval nuclear operations of the Cold War represent a dimension of the confrontation that was, in many respects, even less controlled and even further from political oversight than the strategic land-based forces. Submarine commanders, operating under communication blackouts that were inherent to their operational security requirements, had significant independence. The rules of engagement under which they operated, which have been partially declassified, gave them latitude to take defensive actions that could, in certain circumstances, have escalated into a nuclear exchange without any political authority on either side being aware of what was happening until after the fact. The record of submarine collisions, near collisions, and other incidents in the Cold War period is substantially documented in Norman Palmer and Kenneth Moore's work, and in the declassified portions of both American and British naval archives. The incidents are numerous. American and Soviet submarines tracked each other at close range. Collisions occurred. In at least several documented cases, the collisions involved submarines that were carrying nuclear weapons. The incidents were not reported publicly, were handled through diplomatic back channels when they were addressed at all, and were managed within the classification system with the same administrative composure that characterized the Cold War planning apparatus generally. They were incidents. They were logged. They were handled. They did not become wars. But they were considerably closer to wars than anything the public understood was happening in the deep waters of the North Atlantic. The 15th program concerns the set of operations and contingency plans that surrounded the Berlin crises of the late 1950s and early 1960s, and specifically the classified assessments that were produced within the American government about the likelihood of war over Berlin and the nuclear thresholds that would be crossed if conventional military operations in the Berlin corridor escalated. The documents from this period, which have been released in substantial quantity through the National Security Archive and through the declassification of NSC and State Department materials, show an American government that was operating with a quite precise understanding of how close it was to nuclear war, while communicating to the public and to its allies a considerably more confident posture. The internal assessments of Soviet intentions during the Berlin crises, the contingency plans for escalation through conventional to tactical nuclear operations, and the communications between Washington and the American military command in Europe during the periods of greatest tension show a government that was genuinely uncertain about whether it was managing a crisis toward a peaceful resolution or moving toward a war it could not fully control. The planning documents contain explicit acknowledgements that conventional military operations to reopen access to West Berlin if Soviet forces intervened would likely result in escalation to nuclear use within days or hours. The threshold was that low. The plans were that clear. And the public, in Berlin and in the United States, was told that the situation was being managed with confidence and that the government had the tools to protect Western interests without nuclear war. The 16th program, which connects several of the themes we have already explored, involves the institutional history of the American nuclear weapons safety program, and specifically the internal debates and decisions about whether to invest in fail-safe mechanisms that would prevent accidental detonations at the cost of some reduction in the weapon's reliability in authorized use. The documents from this debate, which extended across multiple decades and multiple administrations, and has been partially illuminated through declassification and through the work of safety researchers who participated in it, reveal a consistent pattern in which safety improvements were resisted or delayed by elements of the military establishment on the grounds that they might compromise the weapon's operational reliability. The specific technology at the center of this debate for many years was the Permissive Action Link, or PAL, an electronic lock that could be installed on nuclear weapons and that would prevent arming unless a correct code was entered. The development and deployment of PALs is now well documented in the open literature, but what is less well known, because it emerged primarily through declassification and the accounts of participants, is how long the military resisted their implementation and on what grounds. The Air Force Strategic Air Command, under General Curtis LeMay and his successors, was for many years actively hostile to PAL technology, and the reasons given in internal communications were explicit. The locks might delay use of the weapons in a scenario where rapid response was required. The safety benefit was real, the operational cost was also real, and the institutional culture of SAC valued operational readiness over safety restriction. The result was that American nuclear weapons were deployed for years without electronic locks, that when locks were finally mandated by civilian authority over military objection, some commands set the combination codes to all zeros to preserve the speed of arming, and that the full implementation of meaningful PAL security on the American nuclear arsenal took considerably longer than the history of the technology alone would suggest. During the period when locks were present but set to all zeros, the lock was functionally indistinguishable from no lock at all. This is documented. It is in the record. The weapons that were meant to be controlled by codes were, in at least some portion of the arsenal for at least some portion of the Cold War, not controlled by codes in any meaningful sense. The 17th and final program brings us to the end of the Cold War itself, and to the question of what was actually resolved when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, and what was not. The historical narrative most commonly presented describes the Cold War's end as a resolution, a victory for one system over another, a vindication of one strategy over another, an ending. The declassified record and the post-Soviet archival work do not support this narrative in the ways that matter most. The nuclear weapons that were built during the Cold War did not disappear when the Cold War ended. The targeting plans that were constructed over decades were revised, but not abandoned. The automated response systems on both sides, the procedures, the pre-delegations, the dead-hand mechanisms, were modified, but not dismantled. The command and control networks built to fight a nuclear war were converted into the command and control networks of the post-Cold War period, carrying forward their institutional logic into a new geopolitical environment. The nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia today remain, by any objective measure, capable of executing plans that closely resemble the plans described in the declassified documents of the Cold War period. The yields are somewhat lower. The numbers of weapons are somewhat reduced from their Cold War peaks. The command structures have been modified, but the fundamental architecture, weapons on alert, plans in place, pre-delegated authorities in the chain of command, automated systems monitoring for attack indicators, persists. The Soviet Union dissolved. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. The ideological confrontation that provided the stated justification for the entire apparatus concluded. The apparatus did not conclude. The infrastructure of the Cold War, the silos, the submarines, the command posts, the targeting algorithms, the early warning satellites, the duty officers watching screens in hardened facilities, did not go home when the Cold War ended. It remained on duty. The contingency for which it was built has not occurred. The contingency planning has not stopped. The declassified record of the Cold War is, in its totality, a record of a civilization that spent approximately 4 decades building and maintaining a machine capable of ending itself, that came measurably close to activating that machine on multiple occasions through accident, miscalculation, and system failure, that was saved from activation not primarily by wise leadership, but by the random distribution of component failures and individual deviations from protocol, and that ended the formal, Competition without resolving the underlying question of what to do with the machine that the competition had produced. The documents are still being released, the silos are still operational, the duty officers are still watching their screens. The system is still running.